This book sold 50 million copies. It was the best-selling hardcover nonfiction book in American history. Rick Warren's face was on the cover of Time magazine, Newsweek, and every major Christian publication in the country. Presidents called him for advice. He gave the invocation at Barack Obama's inauguration. And nobody talks about the churches it destroyed. Between 2003 and 2010, thousands of American congregations adopted the purpose-driven model. They launched 40-day campaigns. They restructured their leadership. They removed hymnals, took down crosses, and transformed their sanctuaries into what critics called holy Starbucks. Some of those churches grew. Many of them split. And across the country, longtime members, people who had tithed faithfully for decades, found themselves pushed out the back door to make room for seekers who might never walk through the front. This is the documented story of what happened when American Christianity tried to run itself like a corporation. And it starts with a book that promised to change everything. In 2002, Rick Warren was already one of the most influential pastors in America. His Saddleback Church in Orange County, California, had grown from a Bible study in his living room to a megachurch with over 15,000 weekly attendees. He had written a previous book called The Purpose-Driven Church that became required reading in seminary programs across the country. But the purpose-driven life was different. This wasn't a book for pastors. This was a book for everyone. 40 chapters, 40 days, one purpose. The premise was simple. You were not an accident. God had a plan for your life. And if you followed the 40-day journey Warren laid out, you would discover that plan. The book became a phenomenon. It sold 1 million copies in its first 4 months, then 5 million, then 10 million. By 2007, it had sold over 30 million copies and been translated into 56 languages. Churches bought it in bulk. Small groups studied it together. Oprah featured it. It became, according to Publishers Weekly, the best-selling hardcover nonfiction book in American publishing history. But here's what the sales numbers don't tell you. The Purpose-Driven Life came with a companion program, and that program would transform the structure of thousands of American churches in ways their congregations never voted on and often didn't understand until it was too late. The program was called 40 Days of Purpose. It was a turnkey campaign that churches could purchase and implement. Warren's organization provided the curriculum, the marketing materials, the small group guides, and the sermon outlines. Pastors didn't need to write their own messages. They could simply follow the script. More than 30,000 churches eventually signed up. And that's when things started to change. The purpose-driven model wasn't just about personal spiritual growth. It was about church growth. And it came with a specific philosophy about how churches should operate. Warren called it the seeker-sensitive approach. The idea was that traditional church formats, the hymns, the liturgy, the religious symbols, created barriers for unchurched people. If you wanted to reach the lost, you needed to remove those barriers. You needed to make church feel comfortable, accessible, and relevant. In practice, this meant significant changes to how churches looked and operated. Hymnals were replaced with projection screens. Organs were replaced with praise bands. Crosses and religious artwork were removed from sanctuaries because they might make visitors uncomfortable. Some churches even stopped calling it a sanctuary. It became an auditorium or a worship center. The language changed too. Sermons became messages. Congregations became audiences. Membership classes became assimilation processes. Pastors attended leadership conferences where they learned management techniques borrowed from the corporate world. Rick Warren himself was explicit about this approach. In The Purpose-Driven Church, he wrote that Saddleback was unashamedly a market-driven church. He described using demographic research to identify his target audience, a group he called Saddleback Sam, and then designing every aspect of the church experience to appeal to that demographic. For many pastors, this was revolutionary. Here was a proven system from one of the most successful churches in America. Here was a roadmap to growth. Here was permission to do things differently. But for many church members, especially those who had been faithful for decades, the changes felt like a betrayal. In 2006, a group of pastors and church members formed an organization called the Purpose-Driven Dissidents. They collected testimonies from hundreds of Christians across the country who said the purpose-driven movement had damaged or destroyed their congregations. The stories followed a pattern. A church would launch the 40 Days of Purpose campaign. The pastor would return from a Saddleback conference with new ideas about church growth. Changes would begin, sometimes gradually, sometimes all at once. Traditional elements would be removed. New programs would be introduced. Resistance from longtime members would be reframed as opposition to reaching the lost. One woman described her experience in a church that had been her spiritual home for 32 years. After the purpose-driven implementation, she said she no longer recognized the church. The hymns she had sung since childhood were gone. The cross that had hung above the altar for generations had been taken down. When she raised concerns, she was told that she was standing in the way of what God was doing. Another congregant described being told directly that if longtime members didn't like the changes, they were free to leave. The church needed to make room for the seekers who would replace them. A pastor who eventually left the purpose-driven movement described feeling trapped. His denominational leadership was pushing the model. His colleagues were all implementing it, but he watched as his congregation divided between those who embraced the changes and those who felt spiritually homeless in their own church. These weren't isolated incidents. They represented a fundamental tension at the heart of the purpose-driven philosophy. The seeker-sensitive model was designed to reach unchurched people. But the people who paid the bills, who volunteered in the nursery, who had built the church with their own hands, those people were already churched. And many of them were being told, explicitly or implicitly, that their preferences didn't matter anymore. Warren's own materials addressed this tension. He acknowledged that some members would leave when a church transitioned to the purpose-driven model. He called this blessed subtraction. The people who couldn't get on board with the vision, the people who were more committed to tradition than to reaching the lost, those people were holding the church back. Their departure would allow the church to move forward without resistance. This language, blessed subtraction, became a flashpoint in the controversy. Critics argued that it gave pastors permission to push out longtime members who questioned the changes. Supporters argued that it simply acknowledged a reality. Not everyone will embrace change, and sometimes a church needs to move forward even if some people choose not to come along. But the question remained, were these churches actually growing? And if so, at what cost? The data was mixed. Some purpose-driven churches experienced significant numerical growth, at least initially. They attracted visitors. They baptized new believers. Their parking lots filled up on Sunday mornings. But other metrics told a different story. Several studies in the mid-2000s found that seeker-sensitive churches actually retained new members at lower rates than traditional churches. People would visit, sometimes for months, but they wouldn't stay. They wouldn't develop deep roots in the community. The very accessibility that attracted them, the lack of demands, the consumer-friendly atmosphere, also made it easy to leave when a more appealing option came along. Willow Creek Community Church, another megachurch pioneer of the seeker-sensitive approach, conducted its own internal research in 2007. The findings were startling enough that the church went public with them. Their study found that their most active and spiritually mature members were actually the least satisfied with the church. The very people who should have been thriving under the seeker-sensitive model were saying that it wasn't feeding them spiritually. Willow Creek's leadership acknowledged that they had made a mistake. They had focused so much on attracting new people that they had neglected the spiritual development of the people already there. Bill Hybels, Willow Creek's founding pastor, described it as a gut-wrenching experience. He said the church had to acknowledge that their approach wasn't producing mature disciples. Meanwhile, many of the churches that had adopted the purpose-driven model were experiencing their own crises. The splits continued through the late 2000s. Congregations that had been unified for generations found themselves divided over worship styles, leadership structures, and fundamental questions about what a church was supposed to be. Longtime members left in waves, sometimes forming new congregations, sometimes leaving organized religion entirely. Some observers called it the purpose-driven exodus. And then there was Saddleback itself. For years, Rick Warren's own church had been the model, the proof that the purpose-driven approach worked. It was one of the largest and most influential churches in America. It had spawned a global movement. It had trained hundreds of thousands of pastors. But even Saddleback couldn't escape the dynamics it had helped create. In 2022, Rick Warren retired after 43 years as Saddleback's lead pastor. He had handpicked his successor, a younger pastor named Andy Wood. The transition was supposed to be smooth. It wasn't. Within months, Saddleback was embroiled in controversy. The Southern Baptist Convention voted to remove Saddleback from the denomination over its practice of ordaining women as pastors, a practice that put the church at odds with Southern Baptist theology. Warren appealed the decision. He lost. But that denominational fight obscured a deeper issue. The church that had pioneered the CEO model of pastoral leadership was struggling to find its footing after the CEO left. Reports emerged of declining attendance. Staff turnover accelerated. The carefully constructed, purpose-driven machine, built around one man's vision and charisma, was proving difficult to sustain without him. Warren had always taught that the church shouldn't be built around a personality. He had written extensively about the dangers of personality-driven ministry. But critics argued that Saddleback itself was the ultimate personality-driven church, a megachurch empire built on one man's books, conferences, and media presence. And now, without that personality at the center, the purpose was harder to find. This isn't a story about whether Rick Warren was sincere. By all accounts, he believed deeply in what he was teaching. He gave away 90% of his book royalties. He reverse-tithed, giving 90% and living on 10. He and his wife Kay devoted themselves to causes like AIDS relief in Africa and mental health advocacy after their son Matthew died by suicide. This is a story about what happens when spiritual communities adopt corporate methods. The purpose-driven model treated church growth like market expansion. It treated congregants like consumers. It treated tradition like a barrier to entry. And it treated resistance like an obstacle to be overcome rather than a signal to be heeded. Some churches thrived under this model. Some pastors built large and influential ministries. Some people encountered God for the first time in a seeker-sensitive service. But thousands of other believers found themselves standing outside churches that no longer felt like home. They had given decades to those congregations. They had raised their children there, buried their parents there, met their spouses there. And now they were being told that their way of worship was outdated. Their concerns were obstacles, and their presence was holding back what God wanted to do. The book promised purpose. For many, it delivered division. 50 million copies sold. 30,000 churches transformed. And a generation of believers left asking a question Rick Warren never answered in those 40 chapters. What happens when the purpose drives you out? If this story sounds familiar, if you watched your own church transform and wondered what happened, you're not alone. And if you want to understand how this pattern repeats across American Christianity, how leaders build empires while congregations pay the price, the video on your screen right now goes deeper. Subscribe if you want to see more. I'll see you in the next one.